Joeva wants to know what a public advisory board is. Yes. It was on the previous slide.
Advisory public bodies. Well, again, this isn't going to apply to school committees because what this says is that to the extent that there's a state or public or quasi-public board, that they have to post their approved minutes on the Secretary of State's website within this time frame, unless that state or quasi-public board is an advisory board. In other words, they don't take any action, they just give advice to whatever their parent body is. But this doesn't apply to school committees anyway because you don't fall within the state or quasi-public body language.
So you just threw that in to confuse us.
I threw that in there to give you the whole picture. My whole picture is your confusion, yes. Your meetings have to be open to persons with disabilities. We had a case a couple years ago involving the town of Newport, the city of Newport, where their town hall was not accessible to persons with disabilities. So just make sure that it is accessible. This goes back to the previous slide about open comment. Nothing in the Open Meeting Act requires you to hold an open forum. And nothing prohibits you from limiting the time to comment on any particular subject matter. There was the emergency provision. Let me talk about that in 1 second because I know there was a question about that. Go ahead.
Michael, Gene Nato, Vice Chair Warwick. You've been going on for about 40 minutes about these meetings. We've really been elected to educate and protect our students. The numbers here are the new ones coming into our committees, going over what you've been just discussing. How does all of this affect our ability to do what we were elected to do? I know it's important. I'm not saying it's not important, but it just seems so much of tying our hands behind us with this open meetings when 5 of us can't get together for any reason whatsoever to improve whatever's happening or taking care of the problems that are happening to us, especially in Warwick. It just seems, is there anything that you see in what you're talking that you would find easier to make improvements on it to help us carry out our responsibilities?
Well, it's interesting you make that comment because coming here, I toyed with the idea of starting this presentation with, if you think that the Open Meeting Act is here to make your job easier, it's not. It doesn't. I mean, call it what it is. It would be a lot easier to have a discussion with 3 or 4 people, and hammer out the issue outside the public purview. But that's not what the goal of this law is. The goal is not only for you to serve the students or the families, but that those decisions be made in the public forum, in the public purview. Now, whether I decided that or I didn't decide that, but this is a law that the General Assembly passed. It's not uncommon throughout the United States, and that's the policy of the state. So, as new members or as returning members, that's what our obligation is to follow and for the Attorney General to enforce. But I've had numerous discussions with, this makes our lives and makes discussion more difficult. Yeah, it does. But there's a balance that the General Assembly decided to strike, and this is what it is.
So you would have no recommendations or any changes? In other words, this is the perfect act for us to work under?
No, I don't know that anything's perfect. The General Assembly convenes every year. I said earlier that to the extent that whether as a committee member or as a member of the public, you think that any law should be amended, there are thousands of bills every year that are introduced to the General Assembly. There were open meeting bills that were introduced last year that, depending on your point of view, would have made things more easier or easier to communicate. But this is the present law, and whether this is the law in 2 years when we come back or not, we'll find out.
Yeah, we just want to make sure that we're doing the correct thing.
Yep.
And when you have 300 or 400 teachers at every one of our meetings, it's difficult to make sure that you're doing the right thing, otherwise you're going to be penalized.
It is, and you know, I'll acknowledge, and part of the reason, I think we're going to breeze through the Access to Public Record Act, and I'm kind of okay with that because the open meeting law is what you're going to deal with at the meetings. You're going to have to deal with the open meeting law as issues are coming up at these meetings, whereas the public record law, you have more time, and usually that's going to be handled by a clerk or something like that. So I'm fine with that. But part of the reason that we put together that checklist, really most of the reason we put together that checklist, is because reading through the law and reading through the requirements are difficult. We acknowledge that. But having that checklist, and I would really urge you to take a look at it, and having that at the meeting really does provide for a good reference point when these issues come up to make sure that you've done what you can to comply with the law. And I would also say that your legal counsels are really your first points of contact when these issues do come up at meetings. They're well versed in what the requirements are. So when these issues do come up, and they will come up, you have somebody at your meetings to discuss these with.
So as a new school committee member, I'm coming from a business standpoint where collaboration and brainstorming is the order of the day. From my perspective, I'm thinking, okay, how would I do both? Would it be possible to record your conversation or, you know, do something such as that and then post your conversation on social media so that anybody could hear what your conversation was?
Yeah, right now the answer to that's no. When I referenced the legislation that was, the open meeting legislation that was put in last year, one of the provisions would have been exactly what you're talking about. It would have been an electronic message board where members could communicate, but those communications would be available to the public to see also. So, you know, I don't know what the law is going to look like in a year or two. It may be exactly the same. There may be some tweaks, but that's what we have right now.
Okay. But why does that have to be a law? Why can't that just be understood that if it's open, if you're posting it for everyone to see? Well, I don't understand why.
Well, I mean, that's what it is right now.
But that doesn't constitute transparency if you post
Well,
it somewhere?
I think the answer to your question is really that legislation moves a little bit slower than society does sometimes. And, you know, the world that you're talking about, the transparent social media world, is not the world that existed maybe even 5 years ago. So, you know, there was a bill, like I said, to consider that last year. Legislation takes time. So I don't know what the law is going to look like in a year or two, and it may very well take into consideration what you're talking about. I think there are arguments on both sides. I think you can make the argument that for people who don't have access to social media, it doesn't provide that transparent world. I think that argument's out there. And you see that we cite the section, if you're going to have an emergency meeting, there's a whole bunch of things that have to be done. You have to post notice as soon as practicable. What I would say to you, though, is how we have defined and what the General Assembly has written to be acceptable for an emergency meeting is extremely limited. And I'll stress extremely limited. It has to be convened only to address an unexpected occurrence that requires immediate action to protect the public. And just to kind of give you an example of how limited this is, if the meeting could be convened with more than 48 hours notice, then it's by definition not an emergency meeting. So this is not a situation where it would be more convenient for our members to meet, where people are going on vacation. This is a situation where one of our prior cases was there's snow on the roof of a school and the school roof is going to collapse. We need to meet within 48 hours. Tax bills have been sent out, but now the court just ordered us to change the formula or not send out bills. Emergent things of that nature, those types of unexpected things where if some action is not taken within 48 hours, the public interest is going to be harmed. So this is a really limited exception. And if somebody feels that the act has been violated, they can file a complaint with our office, or they can file a complaint with the Superior Court, and you see the penalty. We actually, not in the open meeting sense, but in the, you might have seen, I think in today's paper, the public record world, we had a settlement yesterday with the Compass School over a public record violation. So, we do enforce these laws. This Attorney General has been very active in enforcing these laws, so we do take them seriously.